Imagine standing at the edge of a nuclear abyss, where a single wrong decision could have incinerated millions of lives, and the man responsible for preventing that catastrophe was not celebrated for his courage. He was condemned for his restraint. In the spring of 1953, the world held its breath as two of the most powerful men in American history found themselves locked in a collision not of weapons, but of will, philosophy, and legacy. One had already carried the unbearable weight of dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The other had commanded the greatest military invasion in human history on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. Harry S. Truman, the 33rd President of the United States, and Dwight D. Eisenhower, his successor and former subordinate, had once shared the same mission. But by 1953, they had become something far more complicated. Rivals, critics, and symbols of two fundamentally different visions of American power. The Korean War had dragged on since June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel and plunged the peninsula into a conflict that would consume over 36,000 American lives. Peace negotiations had stalled in Panmunjom. Eisenhower had promised the American people he would end the war, and he did. But what Truman said about how Eisenhower chose to end it shook the political establishment to its core and revealed a rift that ran far deeper than party lines or personal ambition. If this story already has you gripped, you are exactly where you need to be. Please take a moment right now to subscribe to this channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves history, because the decisions made in these moments shaped the world we are still living in today. Drop a comment below telling us something you just learned or what surprised you most, because your perspective matters, and this community grows stronger when great history is shared. The story truly begins not in Korea, but in the final exhausting months of Truman's presidency, when the weight of an unfinished war had ground his approval ratings down to historic lows. By late 1952, Gallup polls showed Truman with an approval rating hovering around 22%, a number so devastating it remains one of the lowest ever recorded for a sitting American president. The Korean War was the wound that would not close. Truman had committed American forces under the banner of the United Nations on June 27, 1950, just 2 days after the North Korean People's Army crossed into the South, and the early months had been a catastrophe. General Douglas MacArthur's forces were pushed to the Pusan perimeter, a desperate defensive line in the southeastern corner of the peninsula. Then came the audacious amphibious landing at Incheon on September 15, 1950, a military masterstroke that reversed the tide overnight. But MacArthur pushed too far north, ignoring intelligence warnings about Chinese intervention, and on October 19, 1950, hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer Army troops crossed the Yalu River and sent American forces reeling southward in one of the most brutal retreats in military history. The Chosin Reservoir Campaign in November and December of 1950 became a testament to American endurance under impossible conditions. By 1951, the war had ground into a stalemate near the 38th parallel, and armistice negotiations that began in July 1951 at Kaesong, later moving to Panmunjom, dragged on with no end in sight. Truman fired MacArthur on April 11, 1951, a decision that ignited a political firestorm, but which history would later judge as constitutionally and strategically sound. The war Truman could not end became the war that defined his presidency in ways he never intended. Dwight David Eisenhower entered the presidential race in 1952 as the most popular military figure in America, perhaps in the world. Born in Denison, Texas, on October 14, 1890, and raised in Abilene, Kansas, Eisenhower had risen through the ranks of the United States Army to become Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, the architect of Operation Overlord, and the man who accepted Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims, France, on May 7, 1945. His campaign slogan was simple, powerful, and devastatingly effective: "I like Ike." On October 24, 1952, just weeks before the election, Eisenhower made a dramatic pledge before a crowd in Detroit, Michigan. He would personally go to Korea to assess the situation and bring the war to an honorable end. The crowd erupted. The promise resonated with a nation exhausted by 3 years of bloody stalemate. Eisenhower won the November 1952 election in a landslide, carrying 39 states, and defeating Democratic candidate Adlai Stevenson with over 55% of the popular vote. True to his word, Eisenhower traveled to Korea in December 1952, the first president-elect ever to visit an active war zone. He walked the frozen front lines, talked to soldiers huddled in bunkers, and stared across the landscape that had swallowed so many young American lives. What he saw confirmed what he already believed. This war could not be won militarily without costs the American people and the world could not bear. He began forming a strategy, one that would horrify Hawks and confound his predecessor. Eisenhower's approach to ending the Korean War was built on a foundation of calculated ambiguity, strategic patience, and a willingness to let the enemy believe something terrifying without ever fully committing to it. His Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, was a cold, precise man of rigid moral conviction who had articulated the doctrine of massive retaliation, the idea that the United States would respond to communist aggression not with proportional force, but with overwhelming nuclear firepower. Eisenhower allowed this doctrine to breathe in the corridors of diplomacy. He authorized Secretary Dulles to signal to Chinese and North Korean negotiators through back channels, particularly through Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru in May 1953, that the United States might be willing to use nuclear weapons if the armistice negotiations collapsed. This was not a bluff, or at least it was designed not to seem like one. Simultaneously, Eisenhower worked through the newly installed South Korean President Syngman Rhee, who was threatening to torpedo any armistice that did not result in the reunification of Korea under his government. Rhee was a volatile, passionate anti-communist who had already stunned the world on June 18, 1953, by unilaterally releasing 27,000 North Korean prisoners of war who had refused repatriation, a direct act of sabotage against the peace process. Eisenhower managed Rhee with diplomatic pressure, financial inducements, and the implicit threat of American withdrawal. Every move was calibrated, restrained, and aimed at one objective: ending the war without expanding it. This was the philosophy that would bring Truman's fury down upon him. Harry Truman watched Eisenhower's diplomatic maneuvering from Independence, Missouri, where he had returned to private life after leaving the White House on January 20, 1953. Truman, characteristically blunt and unsparing in his judgments, had never fully reconciled himself to Eisenhower's election or to the methods the new administration was employing. Their personal relationship had deteriorated sharply during the 1952 campaign, when Eisenhower, seeking to distance himself from any political liability, declined to publicly defend General George C. Marshall, Eisenhower's own mentor and patron, against Senator Joseph McCarthy's vicious and unfounded accusations of communist sympathy. Truman considered this an act of profound moral cowardice, a betrayal of loyalty that he could neither forgive nor understand from a man he had once trusted and admired. He had, after all, offered Eisenhower enormous support, had even reportedly encouraged him to run for president as a Democrat in 1948. The personal wound ran deep. And now, watching Eisenhower navigate toward an armistice through nuclear signaling and prisoner manipulation rather than sustained military pressure, Truman's frustration boiled over into public statements that were remarkable for their candor and their barely concealed contempt. He accused Eisenhower of taking credit for a peace process that Truman's own administration had set in motion, and of doing it through what he considered reckless nuclear brinkmanship that could have ignited a third world war. The armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, at Panmunjom, after 2 years and 17 days of negotiations involving hundreds of meetings and thousands of hours of deadlocked argument over a single, agonizing issue: the repatriation of prisoners of war. The North Koreans and Chinese demanded the return of all prisoners. The United States and United Nations insisted that prisoners must be allowed to choose voluntarily whether to return, a principle that would prove politically explosive because tens of thousands of Chinese and North Korean prisoners refused to go home. This was a propaganda victory of incalculable value, proof that soldiers who had fought for the communist cause preferred freedom over repatriation. The final agreement created a military demarcation line roughly along the 38th parallel, established a 2-kilometer-wide demilitarized zone that remains one of the most heavily militarized borders on Earth to this day, and set up the Neutral Nations Repatriation Commission to handle the prisoner question. Lieutenant General William K. Harrison Jr. signed for the United Nations Command. General Nam Il signed for North Korea and China. Eisenhower did not attend the signing ceremony. Syngman Rhee refused to sign at all. When the guns fell silent, Korea remained divided almost exactly where it had been before the war began, and over 3 million people, including civilians from both sides and soldiers from 16 nations, had died to preserve that line. This is the precise midpoint of this story. And if you have stayed this far, you are the kind of person who understands that history is not just dates and names, but the living consequence of choices made under pressure. Please subscribe to this channel right now if you haven't already. Like this video to help more people find it. Share it with a friend, a family member, a colleague, anyone who deserves to understand how close the world came to catastrophe in these years. And leave us a comment. What aspect of this story has moved you the most? What did you not know before? Your comment might be the reason someone else discovers this channel and this community. What Truman said, specifically and repeatedly, was not delivered in a single dramatic speech, but in a sustained campaign of public criticism that historians have documented through interviews, letters, memoirs, and press statements. In his memoir Years of Trial and Hope, published in 1956, and in numerous interviews and public appearances throughout the 1950s, Truman made his position brutally clear. He argued that the armistice Eisenhower celebrated had been achievable months, possibly more than a year earlier, and that the delay had cost thousands of American lives unnecessarily. He was particularly scathing about what he saw as Eisenhower's use of nuclear threats as a diplomatic tool, viewing it as reckless gambling with global survival. Truman knew more than most about the weight of nuclear decisions. He had made the most consequential one in human history when he authorized the use of atomic bombs against Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and Nagasaki on August 9, 1945. Decisions that ended World War II, but initiated humanity into the nuclear age. He believed those weapons were instruments of last resort, not bargaining chips. He had himself resisted pressure to use nuclear weapons in Korea despite desperate moments, like the Chinese intervention in late 1950, when MacArthur and others had advocated for atomic strikes against Manchurian supply lines. Truman's restraint had been deliberate, philosophically grounded, and enormously costly in political terms. To see Eisenhower wave the nuclear specter around as a negotiating strategy infuriated him at the deepest level. Eisenhower, for his part, was not entirely unsympathetic to Truman's frustrations, even as he dismissed the specific criticisms as political and uninformed. In his own memoir, Mandate for Change, published in 1963, Eisenhower carefully explained his reasoning, that the communist powers needed to believe the United States was capable and willing to escalate dramatically, and that this belief, not actual escalation, was what broke the deadlock at Panmunjom. He wrote about the critical importance of communicating resolve without triggering catastrophe, a delicate art that he had practiced on a continental scale during World War II and was now applying to the nuclear age. Historians like Stephen Ambrose and Evan Thomas have since analyzed this period extensively, noting that the precise role of nuclear signaling in ending the Korean War remains genuinely contested. The Chinese and North Korean governments have never fully acknowledged being influenced by it, and some scholars argue that Stalin's death on March 5, 1953, was the more decisive factor, removing the Soviet patron who had been the real backbone of North Korean resistance. Others point to the economic exhaustion of China and North Korea after 3 years of brutal attritional warfare. The truth is almost certainly a confluence of all these factors, which is precisely what makes this moment in history so difficult to reduce to the kind of simple moral clarity that both Truman and his critics craved. The rupture between Truman and Eisenhower was not merely personal. It was a window into a fundamental debate about American power that has never been fully resolved. Truman believed in limited war, in proportional response, in the patient acceptance of political stalemate rather than the risk of global conflagration. He had fired MacArthur for demanding escalation, for insisting that there was no substitute for victory in the traditional military sense. Truman understood that in the nuclear age, the very concept of total victory was a dangerous illusion. Eisenhower, the soldier-turned-statesman, understood something similar but expressed it differently. He believed in projecting strength so overwhelming that adversaries would choose accommodation over confrontation. His new-look defense policy, formally articulated in October 1953 in NSC 162/2, deliberately reduced conventional forces and invested massively in nuclear weapons and delivery systems, calculating that nuclear deterrence was both cheaper and more stabilizing than maintaining armies capable of fighting conventional wars everywhere simultaneously. These were not trivial disagreements. They were competing architectures for American survival in an age of unprecedented danger. And they played out in public through the pointed words of an ex-president sitting in Missouri watching his successor receive credit for a peace that Truman believed was both incomplete and dangerously purchased. What endures from this extraordinary confrontation between two giants of 20th century American history is not simply the armistice, nor the specific accusations, nor even the personal bitterness. What endures is the question they were both trying to answer, a question that remains as urgent and unanswerable today as it was in the summer of 1953. How much strength is enough to preserve peace without triggering war? How do leaders make life-and-death decisions under conditions of radical uncertainty, with incomplete information, overwhelming pressure, and the knowledge that every choice carries consequences that will outlast them by decades? Truman made his choices with a directness and a willingness to absorb political punishment that were almost pre-modern in their simplicity. Eisenhower made his with the strategic patience of a man who had managed coalition warfare and understood that the appearance of resolve could be as powerful as resolve itself. Neither man was entirely right. Neither man was entirely wrong. The Korean War ended with an armistice, not a peace treaty, a distinction that matters enormously because technically the conflict has never formally concluded, and American troops have remained on the Korean peninsula every single day since July 27, 1953. The words Truman spoke about Eisenhower's choices were sharp, sometimes unfair, and deeply human. The words of a man who had carried a burden unlike any other, and could not bear to watch someone else carry it differently. History has honored both men, and history has complicated both men. That is the only honest verdict available. If this story moved you, challenged you, or taught you something you did not know, please subscribe to this channel, like this video, share it with someone who deserves to hear it, and leave a comment telling us what struck you most deeply. Because great history deserves great conversation, and the best way to honor those who made these decisions is to keep asking, without flinching, what we would have done in their place.